6 enemy snipers had turned that intersection into a graveyard. 3 Marine scout snipers had already tried to stop them. All but 3 pulled back with nothing but shame and the sound of body bags. For 63 minutes, American soldiers could not move, could not breathe, could not live without bleeding. The enemy knew it. They laughed between shots. One of them radioed his commander in Arabic, "Let them crawl. We own this ground until we leave it." And then a woman nobody trusted picked up her rifle and walked to the helicopter without being ordered to. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that rooftop. Let's go back to the 18 minutes that changed everything. 6 enemy snipers had turned that intersection into a graveyard. 3 Marine scout snipers had already tried to stop them. All 3 pulled back with nothing but shame and the sound of body bags zipping shut behind them. For 63 minutes, American soldiers could not move, could not breathe, could not live without bleeding. The enemy knew it. They laughed between shots. One of them radioed his commander in Arabic, "Let them crawl. We own this ground until we leave it." Then a woman nobody trusted picked up her rifle and walked to the helicopter without being ordered to. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that rooftop. Let's go back to the 18 minutes that changed everything. The transmission came in at 09:47 hours, and it was not a request. It was a scream. Not from one man, from the collective throat of 37 American soldiers who had walked into a kill zone 40 minutes earlier and had not been able to take a single step forward since. The radio operator's voice was cracking not from static, but from something closer to collapse, the particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself as fear, but arrives as hyperventilation, as short chopped sentences, as the inability to complete a thought without pausing to confirm you are still alive. "Command, this is Bravo 37. We are pinned, unable to advance, unable to extract. We have 4 wounded, 2 critical. Enemy has the entire intersection. 6 positions confirmed, possibly more. We sent up 3 scout snipers, and they didn't get a single one. Not one. We need..." The transmission broke. In the operations room of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a digital map table and did not flinch. She had been awake for 22 hours. Her uniform was clean because she believed in the discipline of maintaining appearances when everything around you is dissolving, but the dark circles under her eyes told the real story. Not exhaustion, but the specific weight of watching a situation deteriorate past every contingency plan she had prepared. She pressed the radio key. "Bravo 37, say again the status of scout elements." The pause before the answer was long enough to mean something bad. 37 scout. 1 pulled back approximately 18 minutes ago. Sergeant DeLuca took a graze to the shoulder. Nothing critical, but his partner broke position trying to pull him, and the enemy read them immediately. Scout 2 and 3, they never got eyes on a single target, ma'am. Not one. Enemy is rotating. They're covering each other. Every time one of ours moved to acquire, they went dark. It was like they knew, like they already knew where our guys would look. Mitchell turned to the room. A dozen personnel, intelligence analysts, a radio specialist, a young captain named Ferris, who had the uncomfortable habit of appearing competent until pressure arrived, and in the far corner, sitting in a metal folding chair with her back to the wall and her eyes closed, Staff Sergeant Avery Cole. She looked asleep. She wasn't. "Cole," Mitchell said. The eyes opened. Brown, flat, completely calm in a way that made people uncomfortable if they didn't know wise and made them more uncomfortable if they did. "I heard it," Avery said. 6 confirmed enemy positions, rotating. Our scout elements couldn't acquire a single target in over an hour. 4 wounded, 2 critical on the ground, 33 soldiers who cannot move. Mitchell kept her voice level because that was her discipline. "Tell me you have something." Avery stood up slowly. She wasn't tall. She wasn't imposing. At 26 years old, she had the kind of build that made supply clerks hand her the wrong size body armor and apologize the kind of face that didn't register as belonging to someone dangerous until the moment you realized she'd already processed you as a variable and assigned you a value. She walked to the map table, looked at the overlay of the urban zone for approximately 6 seconds, and then looked up at Mitchell. What doctrine are they running? Ferris made a sound from across the room. Not quite a laugh, more like the involuntary noise a person makes when something doesn't fit the situation they're in. We're asking about doctrine. We have soldiers dying out there. What doctrine? Avery said again, and she wasn't talking to Ferris. She was still talking to Mitchell, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who asks a question they already suspect the answer to, who asks and only to confirm the shape of what they're already building in their mind. Mitchell looked at her intelligence officer, a major named Cy, who wore glasses and had the posture of someone who spent most of his life indoors. Cy pulled up a secondary screen. Based on engagement pattern analysis from the last hour, position, discipline, rotation, timing, Overwatch coverage, we're looking at structured training, possibly Russian-style doctrine, not irregular. These are not insurgent marksmen picking targets of opportunity. Avery nodded once. How far is the intersection from the nearest viable insert point? For a helo drop, Cy looked at the map. The roof of the textile building on the northern edge gives you a dominant elevation and angle. Distance to the primary kill zone is approximately 640 to 750 meters, depending on a target position. Wind at altitude, 8 to 12 knots from the northwest, consistent for the last 2 hours. Temperature, 91 degrees surface. Density altitude is, I can calculate it. Avery turned back to Mitchell. I need a suppressed 110 your current spotting data from Scout 1 before they pulled back, and a helicopter available in 8 minutes. The room was completely still. Captain Ferris stepped forward. He had the look of a man who was about to say something he would spend the rest of his career describing as reasonable. Staff Sergeant, with all due respect, 3 trained scout snipers just spent over an hour on that problem and came back with nothing. You're talking about inserting 1 operator. The scout elements were looking for targets, Avery said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at him with contempt. She looked at him the way a person looks at a word they have already finished reading. I'm not going in to look for targets. That's why it's a different problem. Then what are you going in to look for? Ferris demanded. Behavior, she said. I'm going in to look for behavior. No one said anything. Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. Mitchell had served for 19 years. She had processed people for longer than most people had served, and she had learned to read the difference between confidence that comes from not understanding the danger and confidence that comes from understanding the danger so completely that fear becomes just another input. She looked at Avery Cole and she read the second kind. Get her the rifle, Mitchell said. Ferris opened his mouth. Get her the rifle, Captain. The M110 was prepped in 4 minutes. Suppressed barrel Schmidt and Bender scope ammunition selected for the temperature and estimated density altitude. Avery checked the weapon with the particular sequence of a person who has done it 10,000 times, whose hands remember the order without instruction from the brain. She made 2 adjustments to the scope turrets without explaining why. A specialist named Reyes handed her the spotting logs from Scout 1. Everything Sergeant DeLuca had recorded before the Greys pulled him back. Avery read through them once standing while the helicopter was being prepared. She did not read slowly. She moved through the pages the way a musician reads sheet music, not word by word, but in phrases and patterns, seeing the structure beneath the notation. Reyes watched her. He was 22 and had never seen anyone prepare for something like this. Do you need anything else, Staff Sergeant? Tell me something honest, she said, still reading. The scout snipers who came back. Did they look scared? Reyes hesitated. DeLuca looked, yeah, he looked shaken. His partner, too. Not just the Greys, like they'd been up against something that didn't behave the way things are supposed to behave. Avery closed the folder. Good. That means the enemy felt safe enough to show it. Overconfidence is a behavioral signature. She handed the folder back. That's useful. She walked to the helicopter without another word. The flight to the insert point was 4 minutes. Avery spent those 4 minutes with her eyes open and her hands still in her lap. Not reviewing plans, not running through anything that could be called preparation in a visible sense. She was doing the things she had never been able to adequately explain to anyone who hadn't been trained the way she was trained. She was letting the patterns she'd assembled from DeLuca's spotting logs settle into the architecture of her thinking. The way you let a map become three-dimensional in your imagination before you drive into unfamiliar terrain. 6 enemy snipers. Russian-style doctrine. Over 60 minutes of engagement with perfect rotation. 0 exposure, 0 acquisitions against 3 scout elements. She knew what that meant. She had studied it the way a person studies something they are slightly obsessed with, the way a chess player studies endgame theory, not because they expect every game to reach a particular position, but because understanding the deep structure of the game tells you something true about the surface of every game. She had read the captured doctrine manuals. She had spoken to 2 former Russian Special Forces trainers who now consulted for American intelligence. She had spent a week in a cold room at Fort Bragg with a whiteboard and 40 pages of engagement data from previous encounters with Russian-trained sniper cells. And when she came out of that room, she could close her eyes and describe the pattern from memory. Russian-style sniper doctrine is not about individual marksmanship. It is about the cell as a system. Each sniper is not a person. Each sniper is a node in a network. And the network's power comes not from any single operator's skill, but from the way the nodes interact with each other, covering each other's movement, absorbing each other's pauses, creating a rotating overwatch pattern that eliminates any single angle of vulnerability. You cannot hunt individual snipers when they are operating as a system. You will always lose. Because while you are looking for one person, 5 other nodes are watching for you. The only way to defeat the system is to understand the system well enough to predict it. She was dropped on this roof of the textile building. The helicopter did not land. She fast-roped the last 12 feet because the rotor wash would have given her position away the instant she appeared above the roofline. She hit the surface, pulled herself into the shadow of a mechanical housing unit, and stayed completely still for 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Below her, 37 American soldiers were pinned behind rubble and in doorways and under vehicles. 2 of them were critical. Every second she spent on that roof was a second one of them might stop breathing. She stayed still for 90 seconds because moving too soon would compromise everything. Because if one of those 6 nodes registered an anomaly on the northern roofline, the entire network would adjust and she would lose the behavioral data she needed before she had collected enough of it to matter. 90 seconds was not patience. It was discipline that looked like patience from the outside. She began to scan, not for targets, for patterns. The M110 scope moved in slow arcs across the kill zone. She was looking at the geometry of the intersection, the angles, the relationships between elevated positions, the lines of sight that crisscrossed the open space. She was looking at the rhythm of the suppressive fire, the timing between shots from different positions, the way the enemy distributed attention across the space. And she was finding it. The rotation cycle was approximately 90 seconds. 2 snipers active at any given time. 1 covering approach from the east, 1 covering the main crossing. The remaining 4 in secondary and tertiary positions, either observing or repositioning. The active pair shifted every cycle, which meant at any given moment, 4 of the 6 were in transition, not fully committed to a firing position, not fully committed to movement existing in a brief intermediate state. That intermediate state was the window. The window was small, maybe 3 to 4 seconds per cycle per sniper, but she wasn't planning to take one shot and wait. She was planning a sequence, and a sequence could be built to exploit multiple windows across multiple cycles if it was constructed with the right timing. She identified the first shooter from a muzzle flash reflection that lasted less than a quarter second. Not because she had exceptional visual processing, every trained sniper can see what she saw, but because she had already predicted where the flash would appear based on the geometry of the rotation, and her eyes were already in that space when the light appeared there, which meant she captured the exact location while someone waiting and searching would have been half a second behind. Half a second is everything. She logged the position in her mental map, not on paper. In her mind, where the entire intersection was already represented as a 3-dimensional grid, each confirmed position lighting up like a node in a network diagram, the distances and angles between them already calculating. The radio at her shoulder crackled, Mitchell's voice low and disciplined. "Cole? Status." "Working," Avery said. Another crack. Captain Ferris this time, and even through the compression of the radio signal, she could hear the edge in his voice. "Define working, Staff Sergeant. We have 2 soldiers down there who might not have much time." I know, she said. Then why aren't... Because if I take a shot before I have them all mapped, the network adjusts and we lose every window we have. If I rush this, the network survives and those soldiers don't. She paused one beat. 3 more minutes, Captain. Silence on the radio, then Mitchell's voice. You have 3 minutes, Cole. Make them count. She already was. She found the second shooter during a suppressive burst that the enemy fired to force the pinned Marines further back from the crossing. The burst was longer than necessary, emotionally motivated. She judged a shooter who was feeling the pleasure of control, who was pushing slightly past the operational discipline the doctrine required. That extra half-second of exposure gave her the angle she needed to triangulate position 2. The third she found because of a mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind that a lesser observer would have dismissed as meaningless static in the chaos of an active firefight. A fragment of movement at the edge of a doorway that lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second. But Avery's mind had already preloaded that space as a probable location, and when the movement materialized exactly where her prediction said it would, it wasn't a fragment of peripheral data anymore. It was confirmation. She pressed the radio key. I have 3 positions confirmed, working on 4 and 5. From somewhere below, she heard a sound that almost wasn't human. A short cry quickly suppressed the kind a soldier makes when they realize they've been hit somewhere that hurts badly but hasn't put them down yet. She couldn't see who it was. She couldn't help whoever it was from where she was and in the phase she was in. She logged the cry as data, approximate position on the intersection, direction from which the shot had arrived, angle of impact suggested by the direction the soldier moved when he was hit, back calculated to a firing position. Position 4. The radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't Mitchell or Ferris. It was the ground element. Sergeant First Class Okafor, his voice doing the thing that voices do when a person is trying to sound and control and almost succeeding. Rooftop element. We have another man down. Non-critical, but he's out of the fight. We cannot hold this position much longer. We have 6 men trying to cover 30 feet of rubble. Whatever you're doing up there, tell your men to be ready to move on my signal, Avery said. Armor machine. Approximately 6 minutes. The pause from Okafor was the pause of a man doing rapid calculations about whether to trust something he couldn't fully evaluate. Copy that, he said. 6 minutes. 5, Avery thought. She'd given him 1 extra minute of buffer. She was planning to be done in 5. She found position 5 from the gap in the Overwatch pattern, the brief 60-degree arc of the intersection that received no coverage for approximately 2 seconds every rotation cycle. Not because any of the 6 snipers were careless, but because the geometry of the urban terrain created one inevitable blind spot in their coverage matrix. She had been looking for it since she first began mapping the geometry, and when she found it, the position of the sniper covering the adjacent quadrant told her exactly where position 5 had to be. She could feel the operation taking shape. She could feel it the way a person feels a sentence complete itself before the last word arrives. Not with certainty, not without the possibility of error, but with the deep particular satisfaction of a structure that is becoming what it was supposed to become. 1 more position to find. The 6th sniper was the most disciplined. She had been watching for him the entire time she'd been on the roof, and he had given her almost nothing. No flash, no movement, no emotional surge that pushed him past the limits of his doctrine. He was either the most experienced of the 6, or he was the one who had been placed in position because he was trusted to anchor the network's most critical node. Critical nodes don't give themselves away. She waited for the rotation cycle to complete once more. She watched positions 1 through 5 in sequence, cataloging each in real time, and then she focused on the space that position 6 would have to occupy based on where the others were not. The doctrine required 6-way coverage with no dead angles. Eliminate the angles covered by 5 confirmed positions. What remains is the space position 6 must be covering. She had been staring at an empty-looking window frame on the 2nd floor of a concrete building when the faintest sliver of additional shadow appeared inside the darkness behind the frame. Not a barrel, not a face. A shadow within a shadow, detectable only because she had been staring at that space for 90 seconds without moving, which meant her visual system had fully adapted to the baseline darkness inside that frame, which meant the marginal addition of shadow from someone shifting their position by perhaps 2 inches was enough to produce a detectable change. She had all six. She pressed the radio key. Mitchell, she said, I have all six positions confirmed and mapped. I know the rotation cycle, the window timing, and the sequence. I'm ready to begin. The silence from the operations room lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Mitchell's voice, and it was different now, not softer, but stripped of everything that wasn't essential. Say the word Cole. Ferris's voice came immediately behind it, and it was no longer edged with the particular sharpness of someone who doubts. It was something raw, something close to disbelief beginning to convert itself into something else. All six, she has all six. Avery wasn't listening anymore. She was already repositioning, already aligning for the first shot, already watching the rotation cycle tick through its final turn before the sequence she had built in her mind over the last several minutes would begin to execute. Below her in the intersection, 37 soldiers were still breathing, some of them barely. The enemy hadn't moved. They were still rotating, still covering, still feeling the particular safety that comes from believing you are in control of a situation, that the opponent has already exhausted every option, that this ground is yours until you decide otherwise. That was the last mistake the network would ever make. Avery Cole put her eye to the scope, settled her breathing, and began to think 18 minutes into the future. She already knew exactly what she was going to find there. She had all six, and the clock in her head started the moment she exhaled. The first shot was not the hardest shot. The first shot was the easiest because the first shot carries no consequence for the network. One node going dark inside a 90-second rotation cycle could be explained as a misfire, a position change, a communication delay. The network would not register a threat from a single absence. The network would continue rotating, and that continuation was exactly what she needed. Position 1 was 643 meters northwest, second floor broken window with a partial concrete sill providing cover from below, but nothing above the horizontal plane. The shooter there had been active for the last 3 rotation cycles, firing suppressive bursts every time the Marines below attempted to move anyone toward the eastern approach. He had a rhythm. She had counted it. He was not a careless man, but he was a man with a pattern. And patterns are just predictions waiting to be read by the right person. She put the crosshairs 2 inches left of where his last muzzle flash had appeared, compensated 4 minutes of angle for the wind reading she'd been tracking, for the last several minutes held a half breath, and waited for the rotation cycle to deliver him back to his position. He appeared exactly when she predicted. She fired. The M110 cycled with the particular mechanical intimacy of a weapon that has been handled and adjusted by someone who understands it beyond the level of operation into the level of relationship. The suppressor reduced the report to something that would not carry past 200 meters in the ambient noise of an active firefight. Below her, no one on either side heard the shot that changed everything. Position 1 was gone. She was already repositioning for position 2 before the first man finished falling. 41 seconds. That was how long she had before the rotation cycle would reveal that position 1 had gone silent, before the network would begin its error correction protocol, before the remaining 5 nodes would start looking for the reason one of them had stopped responding. 41 seconds was not a comfortable margin. It was enough. Position 2 was 709 meters east-southeast, a narrow firing angle through a gap between 2 structures that gave the shooter coverage of the main crossing approach, but limited his own lateral exposure. She had identified him from the emotionally extended suppressive burst, the man who had felt the pleasure of control and let it push him half a second past his doctrine. That half second had shown her his exact position. That half second was now going to cost him everything. She fired. In the operations room of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, Mitchell was standing over the radio with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the digital map. The room had gone very quiet. Ferris was standing 3 feet to her left, and he had stopped talking, which Mitchell noted in some peripheral part of her awareness was the most useful thing he had done in the last 20 minutes. The radio carried the sounds of the kill zone, sporadic fire, a man's voice somewhere below, low and urgent, calling a name she couldn't make out. The ambient noise of an intersection that had been a death trap for over an hour. Then a gap, a 3-second gap in the enemy fire pattern that should not have been there. Cy looked up from his screen. Position 1 just went silent. Mitchell didn't move. Time on target. Approximately 40 seconds since Cole said she was ready. Another gap. Different sector. Position 2, Sai said, and his voice had changed in a way that he was aware of but couldn't control. It had become the voice of a man watching something happen that he had not fully believed was possible until this exact moment. Ferris stepped toward the radio. "Cole, this is command. Confirm status." "Do not transmit," Mitchell said, sharp and immediate. "She is in sequence. You do not break her sequence." She looked at Ferris with the particular directness of someone who is not asking for compliance but announcing it. "Not one word on that radio unless I say so." Ferris stopped. Sai pulled up the enemy engagement pattern overlay. 2 of the 6 position indicators had gone from active to inactive in the space of less than 90 seconds. The remaining 4 were still rotating, but the rhythm had changed. A fractional hesitation in the pattern, the electronic equivalent of a person turning their head because something sounded wrong in another room. "They're noticing," Sai said. "She knows," Mitchell said. Down in the kill zone, Sergeant First Class Okafor had noticed the gap too. He was crouched behind the remnant of a concrete barrier, 3 of his men within arm's reach, 2 more in a doorway 12 feet away, and he had spent the last hour learning the rhythm of the enemy fire, the way you learn the rhythm of something that is trying to kill you involuntarily, completely, with the particular precision that survival instinct produces when there is nothing else to think about. The gap was wrong, not the gap itself. Gaps happened, but the location of it. Position Northwest had been the most consistent fire source for the last 40 minutes. It had not gone silent for more than 8 seconds at any point in the entire engagement. Now it had been silent for nearly 2 minutes, and in the last 90 seconds, position east-southeast had also gone quiet. Okafor turned to the man beside him, a corporal named Whitfield, who was 19 years old and had the face of someone who had aged approximately 4 years in the last hour. "You hearing what I'm hearing?" Whitfield listened, counted. 2 positions dropped. 2, Okafor confirmed. The woman on the roof. Okafor didn't answer that directly. What he said was, "When I give the word, you move Torres to the secondary position. Keep your heads down until I tell you different. Something is changing out there." Back on the roof, Avery was already through the 3rd shot. Position 3 had been the confirmation kill, the shooter she'd found from that fragment of movement at the doorway, the one whose presence she'd predicted before she saw him, and whose appearance, exactly where she'd predicted, had told her something important, not just about his location, but about his psychology. He was a man who trusted his concealment completely. He moved inside that doorway with the fluid confidence of someone who believes the darkness is adequate cover, who has not updated his threat model to include the possibility that someone on the northern roofline has been watching that exact space for the last several minutes. That confidence had kept him alive for over an hour. It cost him the last fraction of a second he needed. 3 down. 15 seconds remaining in the margin before the network's error correction would trigger a full alert state. She moved to position 4. Position 4 was the one she'd derived from the wounded soldier's cry, the back calculation from the direction of impact, the angle of movement, the acoustic signature of the shot. It was the most indirect acquisition of the 6, which meant it carried the widest margin of uncertainty. Not uncertainty in the sense of doubt. Uncertainty in the technical sense, a slightly larger cone of probability around the exact firing location. She did not take the shot at the center of that cone. She took it at the point within the cone that the doctrine said the shooter would be given the position of every other node in the network, and the coverage requirement that position 4 was responsible for filling. The shot broke. 2 seconds of silence. Then the rifle at position 4 stopped firing. In the operations room, Sai's voice had gone flat, with the particular flatness of someone suppressing a reaction they don't have language for yet. 4 down, she has 4 of them. He checked the time indicator. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Ferris had his hand pressed to his mouth. He was staring at the overlay. He was doing the math that anyone in that room could do. 4 enemy snipers eliminated in 4 minutes and 17 seconds each from a single suppressed shot at ranges between 640 and 750 meters against targets who had been invisible to 3 scout sniper teams for over an hour. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How?" he said, not to anyone specifically. Just the word released into the room because it had to go somewhere. Mitchell didn't look away from the map. She didn't go up there to find them. She went up there to understand them. She paused. "There's a difference, Captain. There will always be a difference." The remaining two nodes in the enemy network were now responding. This was the moment Avery had anticipated and built her sequence around the moment she had told herself would come before she ever stepped onto that helicopter. 2 snipers eliminated creates confusion. 3 creates alarm. 4 creates panic, but panic expressed through the lens of professional training does not look like running. It looks like consolidation. It looks like 2 experienced operators abandoning their original positions and collapsing toward each other, seeking mutual support, seeking the kind of overlapping coverage that might protect them from a threat they cannot locate. Consolidation is predictable. She had planned for it. The 5th and 6th positions had been at roughly opposite ends of the network's coverage arc. When 2 nodes go dark and then 2 more go dark, the remaining pair's doctrine-driven response is to close the gap, to reduce the frontage they're responsible for covering, and increase their coverage of each other's approach routes. They would move toward each other. They would choose new positions. They would attempt to reestablish a 2-man overwatch capable of covering the most critical lanes until they could understand what was happening. She knew where they would go, not exactly. She wasn't omniscient and she wasn't guessing. She knew because the doctrine told her, and the doctrine was written by people who thought about defensive positioning in urban terrain the same way she thought about it, which meant the number of viable 2-man consolidation positions in that intersection was not infinite, it was 3. She had identified all 3 when she first began mapping the geometry. She had ranked them by probability. She was already watching the highest probability position when the 5th shooter materialized there. She fired. The sound that came from Okafor's position in the kill zone at that moment was not tactical communication. It was something more fundamental. One of his men, a lance corporal named Briggs, who had been pressed against a wall for over an hour with his teeth clenched and his weapon pointed at an enemy he couldn't see, suddenly said in a voice that was almost normal, "The northwest is clear. I can see the whole lane. There's nobody there." Okafor was already up on one knee. "Don't move yet." "Sarge, I'm telling you." "I said don't move. One more. There's still one more." Briggs looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because whoever is on that roof that knows what she's doing," Okafor said, "and she hasn't given us the signal." On the roof, Avery knew exactly where the 6th sniper was. She had known since the moment the consolidation began, because the 6th shooter, the most disciplined one, the one who had given her almost nothing during the mapping phase, had made his consolidation move with the same precision and economy he had shown throughout the entire engagement. He had moved to the 2nd highest probability position, not the 1st, because he was experienced enough to recognize that the 1st and most obvious consolidation point might now be compromised, that whatever had eliminated 4 of his cell might be watching the most predictable choice. He had chosen the 2nd most predictable choice, which told her something important about him. He was not just following doctrine. He was thinking. He was adapting. He was a man who had survived long enough to develop an instinct that ran alongside his training rather than being replaced by it. That made him the most dangerous of the 6. It also made him, in a different sense, the most legible, because intelligent adaptation in combat under extreme pressure still follows patterns. It still reflects the underlying structure of how a person processes threat information and makes decisions. And she had been reading that structure in his behavior since the first moment she put the scope on his sector. He was going to try to find her. Not just survive, find her, eliminate the threat. That was how he was trained, and that was how his mind worked. He was not going to go to ground and wait. He was going to hunt. And hunting requires movement. Movement creates exposure. She waited. In the operations room, the silence had become its own kind of presence. Nobody spoke. The radio carried the ambient noise of the intersection below, and every person in that room was doing the same thing without coordinating it, counting. Counting seconds since the 5th position went dark. Counting the time since Avery's last transmission. Calculating the gap between where they were and whatever was about to happen. Size screens showed 5 of 6 position indicators inactive. The 6th was the last indicator, still showing active, but it had moved. The signal had shifted from its original location. "He's repositioning," Sai said. "She knows," Mitchell said again. And then, because she was human, and because she had been holding everything down for long enough that a small fracture was inevitable, she added quietly, "Come on, Cole." On the roof, Avery tracked the movement. The 6th sniper was good. She gave him that without reservation. He moved with the kind of economy and speed that only comes from years of doing it low-fast, using every available angle to break his silhouette, never committing to a direction long enough to be read. But he had a problem. He was looking for a threat he couldn't locate, which meant he was scanning, and scanning creates a pattern. Left pause, right pause, up assessment. The pattern is not obvious, and it's not regular, but it is there, and she had been watching him long enough to know it was there, and knowing a pattern exists is 90% of finding it. She watched 2 complete scanning cycles, confirmed the rhythm, identified the pause point, the half second at the end of each lateral scan, where his visual attention was transitioning from one sector to the next, where his focus was between 2 things and fully on neither. She built her timing around the pause. The pause came. She fired. The intersection went completely silent. Not the silence of a temporary gap in fire. Not the silence that follows a burst before the next burst begins. The absolute silence of a space that has been returned to the world. No shots, no suppression, no coordination of lethal geometry from 6 invisible professionals who had owned that ground for over an hour. Nothing. Avery exhaled slowly. She kept the scope up and tracked every position one more time sequentially, the way she had mapped them when she arrived, not because she doubted the shots, but because the discipline of confirmation is not about doubt. It is about certainty, and certainty is earned by checking. 6 positions, 6 silences, 6 men who had believed that their system was impenetrable because no system they had ever encountered had understood them well enough to find the seam. She pressed the radio key. "Mitchell," she said, "all 6 are down. Ground element is clear to move." The sound that came through the radio from the operations room was not a cheer. It was not a collective exhale. It was more complicated than either of those things. It was the sound of a room full of people who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, suddenly being told they could put it down. And the putting down process is not clean or simple or linear. It is involuntary, and it is human. And it sounds like a dozen different things happening at once. Mitchell's voice came through the complexity of it. Level, controlled, but different, stripped of the professional armor just enough to let something true show through. "Copy that, Staff Sergeant. Confirmed. Time on target 18 minutes and 12 seconds. 18 minutes and 12 seconds. Down in the kill zone, Okafor had already heard the transmission. He was on his feet before Mitchell finished speaking, his hand up and moving in the signal. His men had been waiting for the signal that said, "Move now, move fast, move, because someone just bought you this, and you do not waste what is bought at that kind of price." Briggs crossed first. His boots hit the intersection surface, and he was moving, and there were no shots, no suppression, no sound except his own breathing and the rubble under his feet. He made it to the far side and pressed against the wall and turned back, and he was alive, and there was nothing in the intersection that wanted to change that. The rest of the element crossed in sequence, 30 seconds of movement that should have been impossible 90 seconds ago. Okafor crossed last. He stood in the space that had been a death trap for over an hour, and he looked up at the northern roof line of the textile building, and he did not know exactly where on that roof line Staff Sergeant Avery Cole was positioned, but he looked anyway. "Who is she?" Whitfield said beside him. Okafor thought about that for a moment. He thought about what he had just watched happen, not the technical reality of it, not the ballistics and the geometry, but the human reality of it. A woman had gone onto a roof that his 3 best snipers had already failed from, had spent several minutes doing something that looked from the outside like nothing, and had then done something that no one watching it fully understood while it was happening. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." Back at the operations room, Ferris was looking at the engagement timeline on Sai's screen. He had been quiet for several minutes. When he spoke, his voice had shed most of what it usually carried, the authority consciousness, the instinct toward institutional positioning. What remained was something simpler. "I need someone to explain to me how you look at a kill zone that stopped 3 scout teams and see something they didn't see." Mitchell looked at the screen. "You don't look for something different. You look at the same thing differently." She picked up the radio to coordinate the casualty extraction that the cleared intersection now made possible. "That's what she tried to tell you before she got on the helicopter." Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have listened." "Yes," Mitchell said, "you should have." On the roof of the textile building, Avery Cole lowered the M110 and sat back against the mechanical housing unit she'd used as cover from the moment she arrived. She was not shaking. She was not flooded with adrenaline in any visible way. She was the same person who had stepped onto this roof as the helicopter peeled away, the same person who had stayed still for 90 seconds while soldiers below her were bleeding. The same person who had built a mental architecture of 6 interlocking threats and then walked through that architecture one door at a time until every room was empty. But she was also tired in a way that the body doesn't announce until the task is finished, the way a structure that has been under load doesn't show the stress until the load is removed. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to confirm that the tired was physical and not something else, that what was underneath the effort was intact, that she was the same person she had been when she began. She was. She picked up the radio. "Mitchell, I need extraction from the north roof, and I need someone to pull DeLuca's full spotting logs from the last 2 hours." She paused. "There's something in the pattern I want to look at more carefully when I'm back." Mitchell's voice came back with a question she hadn't expected. "Something wrong?" "Maybe nothing," Avery said. "But 6 snipers that well-trained and that well-coordinated in that specific location at that specific time, someone put them there. Someone chose this intersection deliberately and positioned them to hold it for a reason." She looked out over the kill zone that wasn't a kill zone anymore, at the rubble and the empty streets and the silence she had built with 18 minutes and 6 shots. "I want to know whose decision that was, and I want to know what they were protecting." The radio was quiet for a moment. Then Mitchell said, "Extraction in 6 minutes. The logs will be on the table when you land." Avery set the rifle down carefully and waited for the sound of the helicopter. Below her, the casualty teams were already moving into the intersection, and the 2 critical soldiers who had been bleeding in the rubble were being loaded for evacuation, and 37 men who had spent over an hour unable to take a single step were taking steps again, and none of them fully understood yet what had happened on that rooftop. But the question Avery had just put into the radio was already moving through the operations room like a current, quiet and insistent and impossible to ignore once you felt it. 6 snipers, this intersection, this moment, this level of coordination and training and deliberate positioning. Someone had sent them there. Someone had planned this. And whatever they had been protecting, whatever this intersection had been chosen to guard, was still out there. 18 minutes had ended one thing. What Avery had just asked Mitchell meant something else was beginning. The logs were on the table when she landed. Avery didn't shower, didn't eat, didn't do any of the things that the body reasonably requests after 18 minutes of the kind of sustained focus that burns through a person the way a high-intensity flame burns through fuel, completely leaving nothing unconsumed. She sat down at the table in the operations room with the M110 still slung across her back and pulled the folder toward her and opened it and began to read. Mitchell watched her from across the room. Cy watched her. Even Ferris watched her standing near the door with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink, his eyes carrying the particular expression of a man who has revised a significant assumption and is still processing the revision. Nobody spoke. They had learned in the last hour that when Avery Cole was reading something, speaking to her was approximately as productive as speaking to a wall. Not because she was rude, but because whatever cognitive resource she allocated to processing language had been fully redirected toward whatever she was looking at, and interrupting it cost more than waiting cost. She read for 11 minutes. Then she looked up. "Who authorized the patrol route?" she said. Mitchell frowned. "Bravo 37's route was standard. Urban clearance pattern, northwest sector. It's been the operational template for that zone for the last 3 weeks." "Who set the template?" A pause. Mitchell looked at Cy. Cy looked at his screen and pulled up the operational planning records. His fingers moved. His expression changed in a way that was subtle but readable to anyone paying attention. The slight compression around the eyes. That means a person has found something they weren't expecting and is taking an extra half second to confirm they're reading it correctly. "Template was set by Joint Planning Cell," Cy said carefully. "Submitted by Major Dennis Holt, approved through standard channel, implemented 12 days ago." "Where is Holt now?" Avery said. "He rotated back to Ramstein 8 days ago. Medical, shoulder injury." Avery was quiet for a moment, then pulled his communications log for the 72 hours before he left. "All of it. Signal traffic, encrypted channels, personal device if you have access." Ferris set his coffee down. Staff Sergeant, that is a significant accusation implied by a very thin thread of, I haven't accused anyone of anything, Avery said. I asked for a communications log. She looked at him without hostility. 6 snipers with Russian-style doctrine don't materialize at a specific intersection by accident. They were positioned there. They were positioned there before Bravo 37 arrived, which means someone knew 37 was going to that intersection before 37 got there. The patrol template has been in place for 12 days. The snipers were in position before we arrived today. She paused. That's not a thin thread. That's a rope. The room was very still. Mitchell looked at Cy. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a clear signal, but the kind of communication that develops between people who have worked together long enough that shared understanding can be transmitted in the space of a glance. Cy turned back to his screen without being told. I'll have the logs in 20 minutes, he said. Ferris picked his coffee back up and said nothing. His silence had changed character since Avery came back from the roof. Before, it had been the silence of a man restraining objections. Now it was something closer to the silence of a man who is paying careful attention and is willing to be taught. Avery stood and walked to the map table. She looked at the intersection overlay, the same overlay she had studied 6 seconds before asking for the helicopter, the one she had already begun to read before most people in the room understood she was reading anything at all. She studied it now with a different question behind her eyes. What's 1 block north of the kill zone, she said. Cy answered without looking up from his secondary task. Warehouse complex, 3 buildings, designated non-priority during current operational phase preliminary assessment, indicated empty, no tactical value. Who conducted the preliminary assessment? Another pause. Longer this time. Holt's unit, Cy said. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, not explosively, but with an expanding consequence that reached every edge. Mitchell's jaw tightened by approximately 1 millimeter, which for her was the equivalent of anyone else's sharp intake of breath. Cy, she said, bump the warehouse complex to immediate priority. I want eyes on those 3 buildings inside the hour. Already pulling the drone asset, Cy said. Saw him. Avery looked at Mitchell. If I'm right about what's in those buildings, we have a problem that is significantly larger than 6 snipers. How large? Large enough that someone was willing to burn 6 trained operators as a blocking force to keep Bravo 37 away from that intersection long enough for something to clear the area. She paused. Or to finish arriving. Mitchell absorbed that. You're saying the snipers weren't the objective. They were the shield. A shield you don't pull out of inventory for nothing, Avery said. 6 Russian-trained snipers as a blocking force means whatever they were protecting is worth more than 6 Russian-trained snipers. She looked back at the map. I want to know what that is. The drone footage came back 40 minutes later, and what it showed made Cy stand up from his chair. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical quality, but with the involuntary physical response of a person whose body has processed something important before their conscious mind has fully caught up. Mitchell, he said, you need to see this. Mitchell crossed to his station, looked at the screen. Her expression did not change. That was in its own way more alarming than any visible reaction would have been. Mitchell's discipline was the discipline of someone who has decided that her face is a resource she controls completely, and she controls it most completely when what she is seeing is the most serious. What am I looking at? She said flatly. Thermal imaging, North Warehouse Building 2, Cy said. 47 heat signatures. Human. Clustered in the eastern section. He zoomed the image. There's a vehicle in the loading bay. Military grade, not American. Markings are partially obscured, but the profile is consistent with Mitchell. That's a command vehicle. Someone is running an operation out of that building. Ferris was behind them now. 47 people. At minimum, Cy said. The thermal penetration on this drone is limited through reinforced concrete. There could be more. Avery was at Mitchell's shoulder looking at the same screen. She had been looking at it for approximately 5 seconds when she said, the 6 snipers bought them time. How much time did they need? Nobody answered immediately because the answer required calculation. How long had Bravo 37 been pinned before sending the distress transmission? How long had the engagement run before Avery was deployed? How long from insertion to resolution? Mitchell did the math in her head. Approximately 90 minutes from first contact to intersection clear, she said. 90 minutes, Avery repeated. For 47 people, plus a command vehicle to move through a warehouse complex and clear the area. She looked at Mitchell directly. Did they clear it, or are they still there? Sai pointed at the screen. Still there. Signatures haven't moved significantly in the last 15 minutes of footage. Then the snipers didn't buy them enough time, Avery said. They were supposed to hold that intersection for longer than 90 minutes. They failed because... She stopped herself. Let the irony of the sentence complete itself in the room without speaking it, because she had been faster than anyone planned for. Mitchell turned to face the room. This is now a secondary operation. We have a hostile command element in a structure 1 block from an intersection my ground team just cleared. We have a likely intelligence compromise in our planning chain. She looked at Ferris. Get me General Oates on a secured line. Now. Ferris moved without hesitation. Mitchell looked at Avery. Cole, I need you to brief me on everything you observed in the spotting logs that pulled you toward this. Every detail, because when I talk to Oates in the next 5 minutes, I need to give him a picture he can act on, and right now you're the picture. Avery pulled a chair to the map table and sat down. And for the next 4 minutes, she spoke with the particular economy of a person who has already processed everything they're going to say and is delivering it at the speed of transmission, rather than the speed of thought. She covered the positioning logic. She covered the timing. She covered the deliberate choice of that specific intersection relative to the warehouse complex. She covered the implications of the patrol template, the Holt connection, the communications gap. She covered it all without notes, without hesitation, without a single repeated point. When she finished, Mitchell was quiet for 3 seconds. You built all of that, she said, while you were on the roof. Parts of it, Avery said. The rest came together when I saw the logs. Most people would have come back from that roof and slept for 6 hours. Most people weren't looking at what I was looking at. The line to General Oates connected and Mitchell moved to the secure communication station, and the room shifted into the particular mode of a military unit that has just received a massive upgrade in the complexity of its situation and is responding to that complexity with the speed that complexity demands. Avery stayed at the map table. She was looking at something that nobody else in the room had focused on, yet a detail in the drone footage that Sai had pulled back up on a secondary screen, a detail that she had registered in her peripheral awareness while Mitchell was still speaking and had filed away to return to when the briefing was complete. The command vehicle in the loading bay of Building 2. Sai had said the markings were partially obscured. She was looking at the part that wasn't obscured. A small element in the upper left quadrant of the vehicle's front panel, partially visible, even through the thermal imaging's resolution limitations. She knew that marking. She had seen it before, not in person, but in the intelligence files she had studied during the week in the cold room at Fort Bragg, the week she had spent building her understanding of Russian-trained sniper doctrine from captured documents and consultant briefings. The marking was not Russian military. It was something adjacent to Russian military, something that occupied the space between state-sponsored and deniable, the particular category of operational actor that a nation uses when it needs something done in a way that cannot be officially attributed. Her stomach tightened, not from fear, from the recognition that the complexity of the situation had just increased by another order of magnitude, and that what she had thought was the end of a problem, 18 minutes, 6 shots, 1 intersection cleared, was actually the first chapter of something much larger. She pressed the radio key. Sai, the marking on the vehicle, northeast corner front panel. Can you enhance that section? Sai looked at the secondary screen. His fingers moved. The image clarified marginally, not enough for certainty, but enough for someone who already knew what they were looking for. He looked at it for a moment. What am I looking at? A contractor designation, Avery said. Not regular military. Private military company operating under Russian state direction. She paused. Those 47 people in the warehouse are not soldiers. They are contractors. And contractors don't operate on military salary. They operate on mission payment. Whatever they're doing in that building is a paid contract, which means there's a client, and the client authorized funds significant enough to pay for 6 Russian-trained sniper operators as a blocking force on top of whatever 47 contractors cost. The room had gone very quiet around her again. Ferris came back from the communication station. He looked at Avery, and his face had completed its transition from the face it had been at the beginning of this day to something considerably more serious and considerably more open. Oates wants to know if you can identify the contractor organization from the marking. With 60% confidence, she said. I need better imagery to go higher than that. What organization? She told him. Ferris took the name back to the communication station, and she heard him repeat it into the secured line, and she heard the silence on the other end that followed the name, and the silence told her that General Oates had heard the name before, and that hearing it in this context was producing the reaction that the name deserved to produce. Mitchell came back to the map table 30 seconds later. Her face was still controlled, but something around the edges of it had changed, not cracked, not broken, but compressed in a way that indicated the weight of what she was carrying had increased. Oates is pulling a Ranger element for a site assault on the warehouse compound, she said. Timeline is 2 hours minimum for staging. He wants the warehouse held under continuous drone observation until the assault element is in position. 2 hours, Avery said. 2 hours, Mitchell confirmed, which means if whoever is in that building realizes the intersection is clear and the blocking force is gone, they have 2 hours to complete whatever they're doing and move before we can stop them. Do they know the intersection is clear? Unknown. We've had no signal traffic from the intersection since the last of the 6 went down. No outgoing communications detected from the warehouse complex in the same period. Sy looked up, but that doesn't mean they haven't been informed through a channel we haven't identified yet. Avery looked at the map. She looked at the distance between the warehouse complex and the cleared intersection. She looked at the drone feed showing 47 heat signatures that had not moved significantly in 15 minutes. She thought about the math of the situation: 2 hours for a Ranger element to stage 47 contractors who might or might not know their blocking force was gone. A planning chain that had a compromised link in the form of a man currently at Ramstein with a shoulder injury. She thought about something else. Holt had set the patrol template 12 days ago. The snipers had been in position before Bravo 37 arrived. That level of advanced preparation meant this operation had been planned for longer than 12 days. It meant someone had inserted Holt or compromised him at a point upstream of 12 days ago. It meant the intelligence breach was not a recent development. It was structural. It had roots. Mitchell, she said. Who else had access to the patrol template after Holt submitted it? Mitchell's expression shifted. Standard distribution. Planning cell, my staff forward element, commanders. How many people total? Sy answered. 17 individuals with direct access. 43 with derivative access through briefing chains. Then the Holt connection might not be the only one, Avery said. It might just be the one I found first because it was the most visible. She looked at Mitchell directly. Before the Ranger element moves on that warehouse, someone needs to audit the full distribution chain for the patrol template and identify every individual who had access to the timing and route of Bravo 37's patrol. Because if there's a second source, and the second source knows the Ranger element staging timeline, we will lose those 47 contractors and everything they know before the assault force gets there. Mitchell stared at her. In the background, the drone feed continued its patient thermal documentation of 47 people in a warehouse 1 block from an intersection that had been a graveyard 90 minutes ago. The command vehicle sat in the loading bay with its partially obscured markings and its air of something that belonged to the category of things that are not supposed to exist in the way that they exist. You went up on that roof to eliminate 6 snipers, Mitchell said slowly, and you came back with all of this. I went up on that roof to understand why 6 snipers were there, Avery said. The elimination was a byproduct of the understanding. She paused. The why is always more important than the what. The what ends when the last shot fires. The why was it keeps going. Mitchell turned to Sy. I want a full access audit on the patrol template distribution. Every name, every access timestamp, every derivative chain. I want it in 45 minutes. She turned to Ferris. Get back on the line with Oates. Tell him we may have a secondary intelligence problem inside the distribution chain, and we need a compartmented staging protocol for the Ranger element. Nothing about the assault timeline goes through standard channels. Ferris was already moving. Mitchell turned back to Avery. She looked at her for a moment, really looked at her the way she had looked at her before sending her to the helicopter. Reading the same thing she had read then, but reading it now against the context of everything that had happened since. Cole, she said, when this is over, and I mean all of it, the warehouse, the contractor network, the breach, I want a full written assessment of your methodology. Not the tactical execution, The thinking, how you went from spotting logs and 6 enemy snipers to a contractor operation and an intelligence compromise in the same afternoon. Avery looked at her steadily. You want to teach it? I want to make sure it doesn't disappear, Mitchell said. Because right now it exists in one person's head, and one person's head is not a doctrine. Avery was quiet for a moment. She thought about the week in the cold room at Fort Bragg. She thought about the 40 pages of engagement data and the whiteboard and the 2 consultants who had looked at her at the end of the week with the particular expression of people who have just watched a student surpass the lesson. She thought about what it had cost her to build what she knew not, in the dramatic sense of kid and not sacrifice and hardship, but in the quieter sense of years of reading things that weren't assigned and thinking about problems that weren't given to her and staying in rooms longer than anyone expected because the question wasn't finished yet. I'll write it, she said, but first I want to know what's in that warehouse. As if in answer to the statement, Sai's voice cut across the room with the particular edge of someone who has just seen something on a screen that requires immediate communication. Mitchell, the thermal feed, building 2, the signatures are moving. Everyone turned. On the screen, the cluster of 47 heat signatures that had been relatively stable for the last several minutes was beginning to shift. Not randomly, with direction and organization, the kind of movement that means a decision has been made and people are executing it. They're mobilizing, Sai said. Avery was already at the map table. They know. Someone told them. Mitchell's hand went to the radio. Oates, this is Kestrel Actual. We have movement in the target building. 47 plus signatures mobilizing. We cannot hold for a 2-hour staging window. I need options now. The response from Oates came back in 15 seconds. 15 seconds that felt like a different kind of time. Kestrel Actual. I have a quick reaction force element that can be on site in 40 minutes. What assets do you have on the ground right now? Mitchell looked at the room. She looked at the map. She looked at Avery Cole. Avery was already looking back at her. What do you need? Avery said. The question hung in the air for exactly 1 second before Avery answered it herself. I need Okafor's element, the drone feed on a live relay to my radio, and whatever weapons the QRF is bringing. She was already moving toward the equipment rack on the far wall. And I need someone to tell me the fastest route from this building to the north entrance of that warehouse complex. Mitchell looked at her. Cole, you just ran an 18-minute operation. You have been on continuous deployment for... The signatures are moving, Avery said. She pulled a fresh radio from the rack and began syncing it without looking away from what her hands were doing. We have 40 minutes before the QRF arrives. If those contractors clear that warehouse in 40 minutes, whatever they took out of there goes with them. Whatever they know about the intelligence breach goes with them. Whatever they were paid to do in that building, finished or unfinished, disappears into a network. We will spend months trying to reconstruct. She looked at Mitchell directly. I am not tired enough for that to be acceptable. Mitchell held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she picked up on the radio. Okafor, this is Kestrel Actual. What is your current position and element strength? Okafor's voice came back immediately. He had never fully stood down after clearing the intersection. Something in his instinct had told him this wasn't finished, and that instinct had kept him and his men positioned rather than extracting back to base. Current position is 200 meters southeast of the cleared intersection. I have 22 effectives. 4 are walking wounded but combat capable. What do you need? Cole is coming to you. She's running point on containment of a secondary target. North Warehouse Complex, 1 block from your position. A pause. Is she the one who cleared the intersection? Yes. Copy that, Okafor said, and something in his voice had shifted into a register that was not deference, but was something adjacent to it, the particular quality that emerges when a soldier who has seen something with his own eyes adjusts his operating assumptions accordingly. We'll be ready. Avery was already out the door. She moved through the forward operating base with the particular speed of someone who is not running, but is covering ground faster than most people run the ground-eating stride of a person whose body has been trained to translate urgency into efficiency rather than panic. She was running through the situation in her mind as she moved, not rehearsing it because rehearsing implies uncertainty about the script, and she didn't have time for uncertainty. She was stress testing it, looking for the assumption that might be wrong, the variable she hadn't fully weighted, the thing that seemed solid but might shift when contact happened. The contractors knew the intersection was clear. Someone had told them. That someone was inside the planning chain. Holt was the most visible link, but possibly not the only one. And the fact that the information had moved so quickly from the intersection to the warehouse meant the communication channel was short and direct. Not a long chain, 1 or 2 steps at most. That meant someone at Afub Kestrel had made a call or sent a signal within the last 30 minutes. While she was sitting at the map table reading spotting logs, someone in the same building had been alerting the people in that warehouse. She filed that thought. It was important. It was also not the most important thing in the next 40 minutes. She reached Okafor's position and he met her at the perimeter, a large man with the kind of physical presence that gets built by years of carrying heavy things over difficult terrain and never fully goes away. He looked at her for a moment, the same look she got in most situations involving people who hadn't worked with her before. The quick, involuntary assessment that registered her size and age and gender and tried to reconcile those inputs with what he'd been told she'd done 90 minutes ago. She let him have the moment. She had learned not to take it personally and not to waste energy correcting it. The correction would happen on its own. "What's the layout?" she said. Okafor pulled out a handheld device with the building schematic. 3 warehouse structures. Building 1 is northwest, appears empty per earlier assessment. Building 2 is center, that's where your signatures are. Building 3 is southeast, unknown status. North entrance to Building 2 is the primary vehicle access point. There's a personnel entrance on the east side and a loading bay access on the west. Which direction are the signatures moving? She heard Sai's voice through her earpiece. She had set up the live relay before leaving the operations room. Movement is toward the western loading bay. Vehicle signatures are active. The command vehicle's engine is running. They're preparing to move. "They're going to drive out," she said. "Loading bay faces west," Okafor said. "That takes them directly away from the cleared intersection." They were planning to move before the blocking force was eliminated. The route was pre-planned. "West out of the complex onto the secondary road network. Can we block the western exit?" Okafor looked at his element. 22 soldiers, 4 of them wounded but functional. The distance to the western exit of the warehouse complex was approximately 300 meters from their current position. He was doing the calculation speed of movement time available, whether a blocking force of 22 could hold a position against 47 contractors long enough for the QRF to arrive. "We can get there," he said. "Whether we can hold it depends on what those 47 people are carrying." "They're contractors," Avery said. "Private military. They're carrying whatever the contract paid for, which, given the sophistication of this operation, means significant hardware." She looked at him. "But they're not trying to fight at us. They're trying to leave. That changes the equation." "How?" "A force that wants to escape behaves differently than a force that wants to engage. They'll probe the blocking position, assess the strength, and make a decision. If the blocking position looks costly to breach, they may hold, or they may look for an alternative route." She looked at the schematic. "What's north of the complex?" "Open ground. No road access for a vehicle the size of that command vehicle." "East him, the cleared intersection, which they now know is clear of their blocking force, which means they know we might have eyes on it." "So west is the only viable exit for the vehicle," Avery said, "which means if we hold the western exit, the vehicle doesn't move, and the vehicle is what we need." Okafor looked at her. "Why the vehicle specifically?" "Because the command vehicle has communications equipment and operational records. Everything that 47 contractors did in that warehouse for however long they were there, the records of it, the communications about it, the orders that drove it, all of that is on equipment in that vehicle. If the vehicle walks, the intelligence walks. If we hold the vehicle, we have everything." Okafor turned to his element without another word. "Martinez, Whitfield, Chen Western, exit 300 meters, move now. Everyone else on me. Fast and quiet." They moved. In the operations room, Mitchell was tracking the drone feed and tracking Avery's radio signals simultaneously. Sai had the thermal overlay running in real time. The signatures in Building 2 were consolidated near the loading bay, now moving with the organized efficiency of people who have rehearsed an exfiltration, which meant this exit had been planned in detail before today, which meant the entire operation had contingencies built into it at a level of sophistication that made Mitchell's jaw tighten by that same 1 millimeter again. Ferris was on the secure line with material modes, relaying position updates and timeline. He was performing the function of a competent staff officer with a fluency that the earlier part of the day had not suggested he possessed, and Mitchell noted the improvement without commenting on it. People change when the stakes become real. Some of them change for better. Oates wants to know if Cole can hold that position for 40 minutes, Ferris said. Mitchell looked at the drone feed, looked at the schematic. Did the math with the honesty that 20 years of military leadership had built into her calculation process? Not the optimistic math, not the pessimistic math, but the real math that accounts for variables you don't control and outcomes you can't guarantee. Tell him she's going to try, Mitchell said. Tell him 40 minutes. Avery reached the western exit of the complex with Okafor and 14 soldiers, leaving 8 at approach points to the north and east to cover alternative routes. The loading bay doors were still closed. The engine noise of the command vehicle was audible through the structure, a low, persistent vibration that said the vehicle was running and the people inside it were ready to move. She positioned the element in a dispersed blocking formation, covering the full width of the western exit road. She did not put anyone directly in the vehicle's path. That was how people got killed by a driver who decided momentum was a better option than stopping. She positioned them to the sides, with overlapping fields of fire that would make any attempt to push through the blocking force an extremely costly proposition, while giving the contractors on the other side a clear picture of what they were facing. Then she got on the radio. "Sai, how many signatures are in the loading bay right now?" 14 concentrated near the vehicle, remaining 33 still spread through the main warehouse floor. They haven't all consolidated yet. "So the vehicle element is ready to move, but the rest of the group isn't," she said. "Correct. That means they're not running a coordinated exfiltration. They're running 2 separate movements. The vehicle goes first, the rest follows on foot or by secondary transport." She looked at Okafor. "If the vehicle moves before the rest consolidates, the foot element gets left behind. The vehicle commander knows that. He's going to push for movement before he loses the window. But whoever is in command of the overall operation may not want to leave 33 contractors exposed without transport." "Disagreement in command," Okafor said. "Pressure point," Avery said. She had barely finished the sentence when the loading bay doors began to open. The sound was industrial and slow. Large motorized doors built for vehicle access, not speed. They opened with the particular deliberateness of mechanical systems that don't respond to urgency, and in the 30 seconds it took them to fully open, Avery's element was fully set, and every weapon in the blocking position was pointed at the rectangle of light that expanded as the door spread. The command vehicle rolled forward and stopped. Stopped because the driver saw the blocking position and completed the calculation in approximately 2 seconds that any experienced professional completes when they drive a vehicle into a lane occupied by a line of armed soldiers. The vehicle sat there with its engine running and its headlights on and did nothing. Avery picked up the loudspeaker handset that Okafor had pulled from his kit. She spoke in Russian. Okafor looked at her. "You speak Russian," he said. It was not a question. It was the statement of a man revising upward for the 3rd time in an hour. "Enough," she said. What she said through the loudspeaker translated, "You are surrounded on 3 sides. The eastern exit is covered. The northern exit is impassable for your vehicle. You have 47 personnel and 1 command vehicle. We have your position on continuous aerial observation. Reinforcements arrive in 35 minutes. Whatever you were paid for this contract, it was not paid for this situation. Make a decision." The vehicle sat still. 30 seconds. 40, a full minute. In the operations room, Mitchell was watching the thermal feed. "Sai, what are the signatures doing?" "Vehicle element is stationary. Main warehouse floor movement has stopped. They're holding." Sai paused. "Someone in there is thinking." "That's the most dangerous 30 seconds in this operation," Avery said to Okafor quietly. "A person who is thinking has options. Options mean decisions. Decisions mean action in one direction or another. Whatever they decide in the next 30 seconds determines what happens next." "What do you think they'll decide?" She looked at the vehicle. She thought about the contractor organization she had identified from the vehicle markings. She thought about what she knew of how they operated, not from rumor or general intelligence, But from the specific documentation she had read during that week at Fort Bragg, from the engagement data and the incident reports and the after-action analyses that painted a picture of an organization that was sophisticated enough to plan something like this, but ultimately accountable to a client who was paying for results, not martyrdom. They'll negotiate, she said. They don't want a fight they can't win. They want a transaction that gets them out of this with the minimum acceptable loss. As if to confirm it, a figure stepped out of the passenger side of the command vehicle. Hands visible, no weapon moving slowly. He stopped in the light between the vehicle and the blocking position and called out in Russian. His tone was not aggressive. It was the tone of a man who is about to propose something. Avery walked forward. Okafor grabbed her arm. "Cole, he's not armed," she said, "and he needs to see who he's talking to." She walked forward until she was 20 feet from the man. She could see him clearly now, 50-something thick through the shoulders, the kind of face that has processed a significant amount of difficult information over a significant number of years, and shows it not in specific lines, but in a general quality of weathering. He looked at her the same way everyone looked at her in the first moment of assessment, and she waited for the assessment to complete and his eyes to shift from the question to the reality. They shifted, he spoke. She translated internally as he went. His Russian was clean and professional, not regional, the Russian of someone who was educated in it rather than born to it, which told her something about his background. He said, "You are the one who eliminated our security element." "Yes," she said in Russian, "in 18 minutes. 12 seconds over," she said. Something moved in his expression that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, the involuntary response of a professional who has just been told something by another professional that confirms a calibration. "I have 33 personnel who did not participate in the security operation. They are civilians under contract. The vehicle contains communications equipment and operational documentation that my client considers proprietary. Your client's opinion of the documentation is not my concern," she said. "The documentation is evidence of an intelligence operation conducted against American military planning. It comes with us." He looked at her steadily. "And my 33 personnel, detained pending investigation. Nobody gets hurt if nobody makes a decision that requires us to hurt them." Another pause. He was weighing something, not her offer specifically, but the calculation underneath her offer. The same calculation she had been running since the loading bay doors opened. 40 minutes to QRF arrival. 33 personnel who were not in the security element and whose contracts probably did not include fighting a pitched battle against American forces. A command vehicle full of documentation that his client wanted gone, but that he personally might find more useful as a negotiating asset than as a destroyed hard drive. "The vehicle commander has authority to make field decisions," he said. "My client is not reachable in the next 40 minutes. "Then you are the decision," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, she could hear the engine of the command vehicle still running, patient and mechanical, indifferent to everything. "The documentation stays with the vehicle," he said. "My 33 personnel walk out of this without restraints until your reinforcements arrive, at which point we accept standard detention protocol. No weapons discharged by either side." "Agreed on the documentation," Avery said. "The personnel will be escorted, not restrained, until the QRF arrives. Standard protocol from that point." "And you," he said. "Who are you?" "Staff Sergeant Avery Cole, U.S. Army Special Operations." He nodded slowly. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone filing information they expect to need again. "You should know," he said, "that whoever told you about this operation from the inside, they did not tell you everything. There are elements of this contract you have not yet found." Avery kept her face completely neutral. "Tell me." "Not until I have something in writing from someone with the authority to give it," he said. "But I will tell you this much for free as a professional courtesy." He paused. "The breach in your planning chain is not Holt. Holt was a conduit. He was used. The source is someone who was never supposed to be visible, someone who has been in your system long enough that they don't appear as an anomaly anymore. They appear as furniture." The word landed precisely because of its specificity. Not a mole, not a spare bomb, furniture, something so embedded in the environment that it has stopped being noticed as a separate object. She held the implication in her mind without letting it show on her face. We'll discuss the details when the QRF arrives and you have the written agreement you're asking for, she said. Until then, tell your people to stay in the warehouse and keep their hands visible. My element will hold position. He nodded, he turned and walked back to the vehicle. He said something to the driver that she couldn't hear. The engine cut off. She walked back to Okafor. He looked at her. What did he say? He said the breach is deeper than we found it, she said, and he said something that changes the next phase of this completely. What? She looked at him. She thought about the word furniture. Something so embedded it stops being noticed as a separate object. Something that has been there long enough to become part of the background of the environment. We have a source inside our wire, she said. Not new, not recently placed. Someone who has been there long enough to become invisible. She looked back toward the direction of the forward operating base. Someone who made a call in the last 30 minutes while I was sitting at the map table reading spotting logs. Okafor was very still. How do you find someone like that? Avery looked at the warehouse, looked at the blocking position, looked at the 22 soldiers holding a line that was holding because of a negotiation she had conducted in a language she had learned in a cold room at Fort Bragg, because she thought it might one day matter. The same way I found the 6 snipers, she said. You stop looking for the person. You start looking for the behavior. She pressed the radio key. Mitchell, the warehouse element is standing down pending QRF arrival. I need you to do something for me right now before anyone on your staff knows I've asked. Mitchell's voice came back immediately. Go ahead. Pull the access log for the secure communications station in the operations room. I want every login, every transmission, every timestamp from the last 45 minutes. Cross-reference it against the list of personnel who were physically present in that room after I left for the helicopter. A silence of approximately 5 seconds. The kind of silence that means understanding has arrived and the person is processing what the understanding costs them. You think it's someone in my operations room, Mitchell said. I think it's someone who was in your operations room in the last 30 minutes, Avery said carefully. I think it's someone who heard something that told them the intersection was clear and found a way to pass it before the drone was on the warehouse. Another silence, shorter this time. I'll pull the log myself, Mitchell said. No one else touches it. One more thing, Avery said. When you pull it, don't react visibly. Whoever it is, they're watching the room the same way they've been watching it long enough to become furniture. If they see you react, they'll know you found it, and we lose the ability to control what happens next. The radio was quiet for a moment. Cole, Mitchell said, you have been awake for how long? Avery looked at her watch, did the math, 26 hours. And you're running counterintelligence analysis while holding a negotiated standoff with 47 contractors. The standoff is stable for 30 minutes, Avery said. I had time. The sound that came from Mitchell through the radio was brief and involuntary and was the closest thing to a laugh that Mitchell's discipline had allowed to escape in approximately 6 hours. It lasted less than a second. Then the discipline reassembled itself and her voice came back level and clear. 30 minutes, Mitchell said. QRF is inbound. Hold that position. Copy, Avery said. She turned back to the warehouse. The loading bay doors were still open. The command vehicle sat dark and silent inside, full of documentation that was going to answer questions she hadn't finished asking yet. 33 contractors were somewhere in the building waiting for a resolution they had just agreed to accept because someone had done the math and understood that the fight wasn't worth the cost. And somewhere back at FOB Kestrel, in an operations room full of people who had watched her go to a helicopter this morning and come back with things nobody had sent her to find, someone was sitting very still and feeling the particular cold of a person who has just realized that the situation has moved faster than they planned for. Avery Cole stood in the space between the blocking position and the warehouse and let that thought sit where it was. Furniture doesn't know it's been noticed until the moment someone reaches out and moves it. That moment was coming. The QRF arrived in 38 minutes, 2 minutes late, which Avery noted without comment because 2 minutes late with 4 helicopters and 36 Rangers was still 36 Rangers, and 36 Rangers changed every calculation on the board. The contractor element surrendered without a shot fired. 33 personnel came out of the warehouse in groups of 4 hands visible, moving with the particular controlled stillness of professionals who have decided that compliance is the correct operational choice and are executing that decision with the same discipline they would execute any other. The vehicle commander came out last. He looked at Avery as he passed and gave her a small nod, not respect in the sentimental sense, but the acknowledgement that one professional gives another when the outcome has been determined by competence rather than luck. The Rangers processed the detainees with the speed that comes from doing something 10,000 times. Zip ties an individual, searches separation into holding groups. The command vehicle was secured without anyone touching the communications equipment. Inside, Avery had relayed that instruction to the QRF commander, Captain Delacroix, before the helicopters landed. And Delacroix had the kind of operational intelligence that recognizes when a specific instruction comes from someone who understands why the instruction matters. The vehicle goes back to Kestrel intact, Delacroix said to his team. Nothing inside gets touched, moved, or powered down. Treat it like a crime scene. Okafor stood beside Avery and watched the processing with the expression of a man who has been in enough operations to know when one has resolved correctly and when it has resolved by fortune. This one had resolved correctly, and he knew the difference. Your people are good, Avery said to him. Your people kept them alive to be good, he said. He paused. What happens now? Now we go back to Kestrel and find the furniture, she said. He looked at her sideways. She had not explained the word to him, and he had not asked, because soldiers learn early that some explanations arrive in their own time, and asking accelerates nothing. But the word had stayed with him for the last 38 minutes, and he had turned it over enough times to have a working understanding of what she meant. Someone inside, he said. Someone inside, she confirmed. That's going to be a bad day for somebody. Yes, she said, it is. She rode back to FOB Kestrel in the lead vehicle, and for the first 20 minutes of the return movement, she sat in the back with her eyes open and said nothing. The soldier beside her, a young ranger named Castallo, who was 20 years old and had the specific brand of alertness that belongs to people who are experiencing something significant and know it, glanced at her twice and then decided that looking straight ahead was the appropriate choice. She was not thinking about the warehouse. She was not thinking about the contractors or the command vehicle or the documentation that was going to produce weeks of intelligence analysis. She was thinking about the operations room at FOB Kestrel and the access log that Mitchell had pulled and what that log was going to show when Avery got back and sat down and read it. She had been through the list of people who were in that room while she was at the map table reading spotting logs. She had been through it in her head during the standoff, during the QRF arrival, during the processing of the detainees. She had been through it enough times that she had a candidate. Not a certainty, she did not operate in certainties until the evidence produced them, but a candidate built from behavioral observation, from the particular quality of attention that certain people had paid to the conversation in that room, from the timing of the contractor element's mobilization relative to specific moments in the discussion. The candidate was not Ferris. Ferris had been too visibly in the room, too reactive, too emotionally present in a way that was incompatible with the cold parallel processing that intelligence work inside enemy lines requires. The candidate was not Psy. Psy's discovery of the warehouse signatures had been too genuine, too involuntary, too much the response of a man who was surprised by what he found. The candidate was someone who had been in the room without being fully of the room. Someone whose presence registered as background rather than foreground. Someone whose absence, if it had occurred at the critical moment, would have been logged as a minor and unremarkable event, a bathroom break, a phone call, a walk to the equipment rack. She had a name forming. She was holding it loosely, the way you hold a hypothesis firmly enough to test it, loosely enough to release it, if the evidence says release it. The vehicle stopped at the FOB main gate and was waved through, and 4 minutes later, Avery walked back into the operations room. Mitchell was standing at the map table. She looked up when Avery entered, and her expression carried something that Avery had not seen on Mitchell's face in the entire duration of this day. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even the particular exhaustion that follows sustained high-stakes decision-making. What Avery read on Mitchell's face was something harder and quieter and more personal than any of those things. I pulled the log, Mitchell said. What did you find? Mitchell looked around the room. It was less populated than it had been during the peak of the operation. Ferris was there, and Psy and 2 intelligence analysts who had been running the access audit that Mitchell had ordered 45 minutes earlier. 2 other personnel who had been present earlier were gone. Where is Specialist Kwan? Avery said. The room went still. Mitchell looked at her. How did you? She was at the communications station for 11 minutes during the period between my departure and the contractor mobilization, Avery said. She logged in once, and the duration of that session is longer than any legitimate communication task in that window required. She was physically positioned with a direct line of sight to the map table during the entirety of the briefing. She heard the patrol template discussion, she heard the warehouse identification, and she heard me ask about the access audit. Avery paused. When I asked about the access audit, she was the only person in the room who did not look at Cy. Everyone else looked at Cy when he said the number of people with access. She looked at the floor. Ferris opened his mouth, closed it. He had the expression of a man who is recalibrating something he thought he had already finished recalibrating. She left the room approximately 20 minutes ago, Cy said carefully. She said she needed to run a signal check on the exterior antenna array. Standard maintenance task. I didn't. He stopped himself. The incompleteness of the sentence was its own statement. Where is the exterior antenna array? Avery said. East side of the building. There's a maintenance access door that opens onto the perimeter road. Cy's voice had gone flat in the way that means a person is delivering information while simultaneously processing what delivering it means. The perimeter road connects to the vehicle staging area, which connects to the main gate. Avery was already moving. Mitchell was a half step behind her, and the discipline that had held Mitchell's expression level for the entire day did not hold in that moment, not because she lost control of it, but because she chose to release it. Because sometimes the mask is less useful than the full activation of the person underneath it. Lock down the gate, Mitchell said into her radio as she moved. No vehicle or personnel exit. Authorization Mitchell actual execute immediately. The acknowledgement came back in 3 seconds. They went through the operations room, side door, and into the corridor, and through the exterior access door onto the east side perimeter. And the evening air hit them with the particular quality of air that has absorbed the heat of a full operational day and is beginning to release it warm and still, and carrying the ambient sound of a military installation that does not fully stop at any hour. Specialist Rachel Kwan was 30 feet from the maintenance access door, and she was not checking the antenna array. She was standing with a personal communications device in her hand, and she was in the middle of something, a transmission, a deletion, a final action of some kind, and she looked up. When the door opened, and the look on her face was not the look of a person who has been caught in an innocent task. It was the look of a person who has run the calculation in a fraction of a second and has arrived at the result. She was 24 years old. She had been at FOB Kestrel for 14 months. She had processed communications for Mitchell's staff with a quiet competence that had registered as reliability and had therefore registered as invisible, which was precisely the point, which was precisely what the vehicle commander had meant when he said the word furniture. She did not run. She did not try to destroy the device. She stood very still, and then she looked at Avery Cole, and the calculation on her face resolved into something that was not surrender exactly, but was the controlled acknowledgement of a person who understands that the particular game they were playing has reached its terminal position. How long did you know? Kwan said. She was talking to Avery. I had a candidate when I was in the vehicle coming back, Avery said. I had a confirmation when I walked into the operations room and you weren't there. What confirmed it? Your absence, Avery said. Everyone else in that room had a reason to stay when this much was happening. You were the only one whose instinct said move. An instinct that says move when everyone else stays is the instinct of someone who is calculating risk, not professional risk, not the risk that comes from being in a room where things are going wrong. Personal risk, the risk of someone who has something to lose that the people around them don't know about. Kwan looked at her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted not toward remorse, not toward anything that simple, towards something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been living in a long deception and has arrived at the place where the deception ends, and the feeling of arriving there is not what they expected it to feel like. You went up on that roof to eliminate snipers, Kwan said. You came back and unraveled everything. I came back with questions, Avery said. The answers unraveled it. Mitchell stepped forward and took the communications device from Kwan's unresisting hand. She looked at it. She looked at Kwan. And the thing on Mitchell's face in that moment was something that would not have a clean name if you tried to name it, the specific grief of a commander who has been betrayed from inside, which is a different quality of grief from any other kind. because it contains the question of what you missed and when you missed it and whether you could have seen it earlier if you had been looking differently. How long? Mitchell said. Quan looked at her. 14 months. The number landed in the space between them with the weight of every operation, every briefing, every piece of information that had moved through that operations room in 14 months, while Rachel Quan sat at the communication station and appeared as furniture. Who ran you? Mitchell said. That's a conversation for the debrief, Quan said. She said it without hostility, without defiance. She said it as a person who has accepted the structure of what comes next and is moving into it with the same professional economy she had used to move through the last 14 months. I'll talk. I have conditions, but I'll talk. Mitchell looked at her for a long time. Then she stepped back, and two security personnel who had come through the door behind them moved forward and took Quan into custody with the quiet efficiency of people executing a protocol. Avery watched it happen. She felt the particular flatness that follows the resolution of something that has been building throughout an entire day, not emptiness, not satisfaction, but the specific quality of a completed calculation. The answer has been found. The proof is finished. What remains is the aftermath, which belongs to other people and other processes and is no longer the problem she was built to solve. Mitchell came to stand beside her as the security element moved Quan toward the building. 14 months, Mitchell said. She was good, Avery said. She was very good. She chose a position that nobody watches carefully because everybody needs it to function, and functioning things stop being examined. She paused. The only reason I found her is because the vehicle commander told me she existed. And the only reason he told me that is because I gave him a reason to. The negotiation. The negotiation. He saw something worth trading for. Avery looked at the device in Mitchell's hand. Whatever is on that device, and whatever she tells the debrief team, it's going to connect to the contractor network, and the contractor network is going to connect to whoever hired them, and whoever hired them is going to connect to whoever inserted Quan 14 months ago. She looked at Mitchell. This is a long thread. It doesn't end tonight. No, Mitchell said, but tonight is where it started unraveling. They went back inside. The operations room had changed in the way that operations rooms change when the acute phase of something is over and the institutional phase is beginning. More people arriving who deal in documentation and process rather than real-time decision laptops opening the particular administrative energy of an organization converting a crisis into a record. General Oates was on the secure line again this time, with people from agencies that don't announce themselves by name. The command vehicle from the warehouse was being processed by a technical intelligence team that had been flown in specifically for the equipment inside it. Ferris came to Avery when she sat down. He stood in front of her for a moment without speaking, which for Ferris was an unusual condition. He was a man who had opinions and the instinct to express them, and the instinct was currently in conflict with something else, the particular humility of someone who has been wrong in front of people they needed to be right in front of. This morning, he said finally, when you said you were going in to look for behavior, not targets. Yes, she said. I should have understood that faster. You understood it eventually, she said. That's what matters. He nodded. He started to say something else, stopped, reconsidered. What you did today, the roof, the warehouse, finding Quan. Is that something that can be taught? She looked at him steadily. It's something that can be learned. Teaching it is different from learning it. She paused. Mitchell asked me the same thing. I told her I'd write it. Will you come? Yes. He nodded again and stepped back, and she appreciated that he did not try to extend the conversation into gratitude or analysis, that he let it be what it was and moved away. Cy brought her coffee without being asked. Set it on the table, didn't say anything. She appreciated that too. She drank the coffee and looked at the map table and thought about what the next weeks were going to look like. The debrief of Quan, the intelligence exploitation of the command vehicle's communications equipment, the reconstruction of 14 months of compromised operational planning, the contractor network and its client and the client's client, and however many layers deep that chain went before it connected to the thing at the center that had decided FOB Kestrel was worth the investment of a 14-month penetration and 6 Russian-trained sniper operators. She thought about the 6 snipers. She thought about the fact that 6 people had died today because someone had placed them in a position where dying was the outcome that her particular way of thinking made inevitable. She did not carry that weight in the way that people who have not done what she does sometimes imagine that people who do what she does carry it. She carried it differently, not as guilt, because guilt implies an error, and eliminating 6 snipers who were killing American soldiers was not an error. She carried it as information, as the concrete and irreversible consequence of the problem she had been given and the solution she had built. 6 people had died today because the system they served had placed them in a position that her analysis made inescapable, and that truth lived in her the way all consequential truths live in the people who are responsible for them, permanently, quietly, and without resolution. The debrief started at 2200 hours. It ran for 4 hours. Avery sat across a table from a man named Garrett, who worked for an agency he did not name, and asked questions with the particular precision of someone who has been trained to extract the maximum information from the minimum prompting. She answered every question completely and in order, and without elaboration beyond what the question required. She was good at debriefs because she treated them the same way she treated everything as a problem with a structure, and the structure of a debrief is that the truth is the only efficient path through it. At one point, Garrett looked up from his notes and said, "You identified the contractor organization from a partially obscured vehicle marking in a low-resolution thermal image." "Yes," she said. "How confident are you in that identification?" 83% by the time I stated it. Higher now, given the documentation from the vehicle confirms the organizational affiliation. He wrote something. "Where did you acquire knowledge of that specific contractor organization's vehicle markings?" "Fort Bragg approximately 2 years ago. Cold room 1 week, 40 pages of engagement data." She paused. "I asked for the briefing. It wasn't assigned." Garrett looked at her over his notes. "You asked for a briefing on a contractor organization operating under Russian state direction as an elective study. I was trying to understand the full spectrum of what the doctrine I was studying would be supported by," she said. "Doctrine doesn't exist in isolation. It exists inside an institutional structure. Understanding the doctrine means understanding the institution. Understanding the institution means knowing who writes the checks." Garrett looked at her for a moment, then he wrote something considerably longer than he had been writing. The debrief concluded at 0200 hours. Kwan's debrief was running in a parallel room and would run for considerably longer. The early indications from that room, relayed in summary by the liaison officer who moved between both debriefs, were that Kwan was talking, that her conditions had been accepted in principle, pending review, and that what she was telling the debrief team was producing the particular quality of attention that information produces when it connects dots that have been sitting unconnected for a long time. Avery walked out of the debrief room and down the corridor and found Mitchell waiting in the hallway. Mitchell had not slept. She had the look of someone who was operating on the particular fuel that leaders burn when the situation does not permit any other fuel, the combination of responsibility and resolve, and the refusal to abdicate either. "Oates wants to talk to you tomorrow," Mitchell said. "Not a debrief, a conversation." "About what?" He didn't specify, but he said to tell you that he's been in this business for 31 years and he has never seen anyone go from a sniper elimination to a contractor standoff to an internal intelligence identification in a single operational day. Mitchell looked at her. "He said he wants to understand how the thinking works." "I told you I'd write it," Avery said. "He wants to hear it first," Mitchell said. "In person." Avery nodded. She was very tired now. Not the tired of a body that has been pushed past a reasonable limit. She had trained past reasonable limits enough times that the body's reasonable limits had moved, but the tired that comes after the thinking finally stops after the problem is complete and there is nothing left to process, and the mind is asked to simply exist for a while without a task in front of it. "Mitchell," she said. "Yes." "The thing the vehicle commander said about whoever is at the center of this. He said there are elements of the contract we haven't found yet." She looked at her directly. "Kwan is talking. The vehicle documentation is being exploited. But the person who inserted Kwan 14 months ago and funded 6 Russian-trained operators and hired 47 contractors, that person hasn't surfaced yet. Everything we found today is the perimeter of something. The center is still intact." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "You think we need to go deeper?" "I think the work we did today opened a door," Avery said. "I think what's behind that door is why all of it was worth the investment to the people who planned it." She paused. "I'm not done with this." Mitchell looked at her. She looked at her the way she had looked at her 3 times before today, before the helicopter when she read the second kind of confidence, after the roof when she read what the 18 minutes had produced, before the warehouse when she read the answer to the question of what do you need. She looked at her now, and she read something she had not had a name for at any of those earlier moments, but had a name for now. No, Mitchell said, I don't think you are. 3 weeks later, in a closed session briefing room, at a location that does not appear on the official schedule of anyone present, Avery Cole stood in front of 14 people and presented a methodology document that she had written in the evenings after the daily operational work was done, in the particular hours when the base was quiet enough that the only sound was the ventilation system and the distant activity of a military installation that does not fully stop. The document was 47 pages. It was titled simply, Prediction-Based Counter-Sniper Doctrine, a framework for pattern analysis in hostile urban environments. It covered the theoretical foundation, the analytical methodology, the decision architecture, and the operational application. It covered what she had done on the roof in the systematic terms that made it teachable rather than merely replicable by people who happened to share her particular combination of training and instinct. The 14 people in that room included 3 generals, 2 intelligence directors, a deputy national security advisor, and 7 people from agencies and organizations whose names were not on the agenda. They read the document before she presented it. They had questions. The questions were good, the questions of people who understood enough to know what they didn't understand, which is the most useful kind of audience. She answered every question. At the end of the session, one of the generals, a woman named Ashworth, who had 34 years of service, and the particular quality of someone who has seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything, but has not allowed that immunity to surprise to become immunity to recognition, looked at Avery across the table and said, "My 18-minute operation, I've read the after action 3 times. I want to ask you directly when you went up on that roof, did you know you could do it?" Avery looked at her. She thought about the 90 seconds of stillness on the roof. She thought about the spotting logs on the helicopter and the mental architecture she had been building since before she put her feet on the roof. She thought about what knowing means when you have done enough preparation that the outcome of the work is not in doubt, but the execution of it is always in the moment, always dependent on the particular quality of attention you bring to the specific instant in front of you. I knew I understood the problem, she said. Whether I could execute the solution depended on what the problem gave me to work with. She paused. It gave me enough. Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. It gave you 18 minutes. 12 seconds over, Avery said. Something moved through the room. Not laughter, not the sharp release of tension, but the quiet collective recognition of a human detail that makes a large thing real. The 12 seconds, the one imperfection in an operation that had no other imperfections held by the person who performed it as the honest accounting of the gap between the plan and the execution. The briefing concluded. The document was classified at a level that meant most of the people it would eventually be used to train would never know where it came from or who wrote it. That was the nature of this work. The most consequential things happen in the most invisible places. And the people who do them learn early that legacy in this profession is not measured in recognition. It is measured in what continues after you are gone, in the doctrine that outlives the moment, in the methodology that gets picked up by someone in a cold room somewhere, years from now, who reads it and understands it and adds something to it and goes out and does something that would not have been possible without it. Okafor sent her a message 3 months after the operation. It was short. He was not a man who spent words on things that didn't need spending. The message said Briggs made it through his evaluation. He's going to scout school. I told him about the roof. He said he wants to learn what you did. I told him to start by learning to be still for 90 seconds. She read it twice. She thought about Briggs, 19 years old, with a face that had aged 4 years in 1 hour, who had crossed that intersection first and made it to the other side and pressed against the wall with the alive animal shock of a person who expected to be shot and wasn't. She thought about what it meant that he was going to scout school, about what it meant that Okafor had told him about the roof, about what it meant to be still for 90 seconds when every instinct in a human body is telling you to move to act, to resolve the urgency of the situation in any way that expresses the urgency, rather than containing it. 90 seconds. Not patience. Discipline. She wrote back, "Tell him the stillness is the work. Everything else follows from the stillness." She sent it and closed the message and returned to the document she was working on, the second document, the one that had grown out of the first, the one that addressed not just the counter-sniper methodology, but the broader framework of behavioral pattern analysis applied to intelligence identification in closed institutional environments. The work that had started on a rooftop at 640 meters and ended in a hallway with a specialist who had been furniture for 14 months. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time, but it had a shape now, and the shape was hers, and she had built it from the truth that everything she had ever needed to find had been findable. Not because she was the best shooter, though she was very good, and not because she was fearless, though she had learned to hold fear at a distance that made it usable rather than paralyzing. But because she had understood something that most people in her profession did not arrive at until much later, if they arrived at it at all. The target is never the target. The target is the system the target belongs to. And the system is always predictable because systems are built by human beings, and human beings, no matter how trained or disciplined or ruthless, always follow the logic of what they believe. Understand the belief and you understand the behavior. Understand the behavior and you can write the future before it happens. 6 snipers had believed that their system was impenetrable. They had been wrong. 14 months of embedded intelligence work had believed it was invisible. It had been wrong. 47 contractors had believed their exit was clear. They had been wrong. They had all been wrong for the same reason in the end. They were predictable, and anything predictable can be eliminated. Not by speed, not by firepower, not by the size of the force or the quality of the equipment or the weight of the institution behind the person pulling the trigger. By understanding. Only by understanding. That was the lesson. That was all of it. That was everything.